Old vaudeville trick. Good evening, ladies and germs. I'm Stuart Lane, and you're not. This is what happens when you're in the Palace Theater. The ghost and the history sort of rubs off on you, and you are enticed and invited to join in anytime you like with your own. Those are certain classic openers and lines from the days of vaudeville. The Palace Theater certainly being one of the Valhalla of vaudeville in its day. Trav S.D. has written a wonderful, wonderful book on the history of vaudeville. He's included a couple of chapters on the Palace itself. He got a terrific, terrific review from the New York Times. So I'm proud to present to you the wonderful, insightful, and knowledgeable, and very funny Trav S.D.
In vaudeville, we call that a tough act to follow. Get these out of the way. So, some shack, huh? I understand that after this, they're going to open up a monster show. With vampires for the kids. I want to thank Stuart Lane and Bonnie Conley for generously sharing their home with me tonight, and Helen Goditis from the Theater Museum, who was instrumental in a few other people I'd like to acknowledge who are here tonight. You just missed Joe Franklin, who I'm thrilled to say is the closest thing to an actual vaudevillian. He came and he paid a little visit. He worked for Eddie Cantor when he first came to the city, and probably knew half the people in this book. So he's a living treasure. I also want to thank Denise Oswald. Where's Denise? My editor at crazy visionary who thought there might be a book in vaudeville. Me. And I'm very pleased and kind of flabbergasted to report that my high school drama teacher,
Yay!
Denise, down here with if she weren't alive, I would not have been here today. And that's not, I'm not fooling around. And Frank Cullen of the American Vaudeville Museum is here. And if there's a real vaudeville scholar in the room, it's Frank. I'm kind of half in and half out of costume today, and that's because we're going to do some unaccustomed non-clowning and talk for real, and it's just too weird to talk about real stuff when you're wearing grease paint. You would have been freaked out. It's kind of perverted. So, to begin, this evening means a great deal to me, and only partially for selfish reasons. It represents an opportunity to increase awareness of what I feel is a sort of an unrecognized or an under-recognized national treasure, the Palace. In so doing, it's also going to further the mission and the fortunes of the Theater Museum, an institution long overdue and badly needed. Now, I'm not a historian, but I play one on TV. I like drama, and the one thing that's always guaranteed to get me all head up is when something of incredible importance has been sort of unjustly forgotten. I consider the Palace to be in that category. On the one hand, it's a theater that's so famous it's become an idiom. Playing the Palace, I played the Palace. I venture to say that the Q factor of that phrase hovers somewhere around that of the lyrics to Happy Birthday. But on the other hand, and some theater buffs and old-timers might disagree with me, but I'm certain that I'm right, that a shockingly low number of people have any idea, one, that the phrase refers to an actual specific theater. Two, if they do, even fewer today know where that fabulous theater is. And three, among those, even fewer than that, know that it's still in existence. For a shocking example, I didn't. That comes across as a joke, but it's the truth. I like to think I have a much higher than average theatrical knowledge than most people. Wasn't until I began researching vaudeville, and let's be truthful, who does that? Wasn't until then that the pieces started to fall into place. And Sure, I guess I was aware that one of the Broadway theaters was called the Palace, but there are hundreds of theaters that are called the Palace. It's like the Majestic or the Bijou or the Rialto. I didn't know that this one was the Palace in that idiom. I met someone today from the theater industry who works not a block from here, who didn't know the Palace was here. I know it's kind of hard to know what to compare that to, but I was thinking of the movie Melvin and Howard. And there's some guy in your car, and he's named Howard, and he's eccentric, and he's got a long gray beard. And then it turns out to be Howard Hughes. And it's like one of the most famous, richest men alive. You knew that it was Howard. You just didn't know that it was Howard. Well, it's the same here. I think this is, people know that this is a Palace Theater. They don't know that it's the Palace. So in all justice, they ought to. It ought to be a tourist stop as inevitable as the Empire State Building or the Statue of Liberty in Rockefeller Center, because in its own way, it's just as important to American culture. What's the significance of the Palace? Well, the Palace was the biggest of all the big-time vaudeville theaters when vaudeville was really coming of age as an American institution. The old stereotype of vaudeville is like that it's a shabby enterprise, and they're throwing tomatoes at you, and it's a bad comedian and a bad singer and dancers who can't keep time. And you'll see when you take this tour, this place is an incredibly gorgeous palace. It's a palace. It was before radio, before TV. You would come to this Mecca, this Valhalla of vaudeville, and enter a dream. And it was variety entertainment. This palace was the flagship of vaudeville's most prestigious chain, in essence, the capital of show business. During the critical years when Bob Hope, Jack Benny, Milton Berle, Burns and Allen, Fanny Brice, and that entire generation of stars were getting started. Singers Midgets also played the Palace, and they're long gone now, but they seem to have left me this podium. Well, since it ceased to serve that important function about 30 years before I was born, I'll defer to the rhapsody of one of the Palace's success stories, the comedian Jack Haley, known best as the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz, but known to audiences in the 20s and 30s for a lot of other stage and screen roles. Here's a useful book. Okay, this is Jack Haley. Only a vaudevillian who has trod its stage can really tell you about it. Audiences can tell you about who they saw there and how they enjoyed them, but only a performer can describe the anxieties, the joys, the anticipation, and the exultation of a week's engagement at the Palace. The walk through the Iron Gate on 47th Street through the courtyard up to the stage door was the cum laude walk to a show business diploma. A feeling of ecstasy came with the knowledge that this was the Palace, the epitome of the more than 15,000 vaudeville theaters in America, and the realization that you have been selected to play it. Of all the thousands upon thousands of vaudeville performers in the business, you are there. This was a dream fulfilled. This was the pinnacle of variety success. On any given night, this was the place to be on the entire planet. I picture an atmosphere sort of like the NBC Tonight Show in its heyday, in the sense that this is where you'd go to see what all the top acts in the country were doing at that particular moment. Only you couldn't watch it at TV at home. You'd have to be lucky enough to be in New York and come physically here to see it. Alongside you in the audience, there were agents, scouts, bookers, reviewers, performers, all there to see whoever was hottest at that particular moment. Why here? Why? I'm glad you asked. I'm sure most of you know that New York's theater district has always moved with the heart of the city. It started out way, way downtown near City Hall, then it moved up to like the Bowery and Lower Broadway, and then it moved to Union Square, and then around 23rd Street. It just crept up with the heart of the city to 34th Street, and then finally here. The first vaudeville manager to build theaters in this neighborhood was Oscar Hammerstein, who was the grandfather of the lyricist, who was kind of a let's call him a visionary. He was an eccentric, but he was very good with money, and he built an enormous theater across the street called the Olympia, which was so enormous that it only lasted a few years. Then he built another one called the Victoria, which ended up being among the most cherished and popular vaudeville theaters of its day, roughly from around the turn of the century until the Palace came into being. So it was so successful that the managers of the other chains signed a kind of a treaty with him, saying that if he wouldn't build a chain of his own, they wouldn't infringe on his territory, which was Times Square. However, the truce held good for many years, but there was a lot of money to be made in vaudeville. And the entire corporate history of the industry is one of head-to-head battles, underhanded cheats, dirty tricks, and backstabbing. Virtually no vaudeville manager had his hands clean as far as this goes. Most of you probably know the name Martin Beck. There was a theater in the area named after him until just a couple years ago. Now it's the Al Hirschfeld. He was a great Broadway producer, but he was also one of the vaudeville managers back in the day. He ran the Orpheum circuit, which controlled the big-time houses. The Orpheum was the big-time circuit west of Chicago, and he was also the head of the Western Vaudeville Managers Association. And that fact emboldened him to try a gambit. This has a payoff, by the way. It's like business history, but it does. The Hammerstein agreement was with an organization called the Vaudeville Managers Association, whose dominant members were B.F. Keefe and his manager, Edward F. Albee, who's the grandfather of the playwright Edward Albee, who you'll never hear talk about his grandfather. Beck's rather crudely aggressive ploy was to say that the Hammerstein agreement applied to them and not to him because he was with the Western Vaudeville Managers Association. And so he built the Palace right here to be the flagship of a new chain that he was planning, and they started building in 1912. As you can imagine, this made a lot of people very angry. And though Hammerstein was righteously angry, interestingly, probably angrier was Edward F. Albee, because this was going to be the heart of vaudeville, the sort of the gem in Times Square. And he saw that whoever had it would be in control of the whole vaudeville industry, and it wasn't going to be him. So what he did was when Beck was in Europe booking Sarah Bernhardt and some other high-toned acts for the Palace, he sort of he leveraged a way to get majority stock in the Palace and took it over that way. And then it was the flagship in the Keith Albee chain. I know that sounds complicated, but that's how it got to be the vaudeville theater in the country. It opened in 1913. And the opening bill is notable for one thing. It included the last vaudeville engagement of the incomparable Ed Wynn. Wynn was billed as the perfect fool, and he went on to have a string of major Broadway successes in the form of revues built around his silly, clownish persona. Today, he's best known probably for his portrayal of the uncle in Mary Poppins who sings that song, I Love to Laugh. I forget the character's name, but whenever anyone sees him in some other context, they go, oh, from Mary Poppins. But the thing was, he was a major vaudeville star for many years. And his last vaudeville engagement was here at the opening week of the Palace. For the first couple of months, the action at the Palace was very ho-hum, just standard run-of-the-mill vaudeville bills of the sort available anywhere. And the press was only too glad to skewer Albee and took full advantage of the opportunity to do so. But then the divine Sarah arrived, and they did banner business, and a turnaround began. Ethel Barrymore appeared here around the same time, And having these high-priced, legitimate stars of the legitimate stage injected the place with a lot of class all of a sudden, made it special. The second year of the Palace, World War I began. And though it didn't begin for the US, there were already repercussions here. One example, in 1914, the ballroom dance team of Vernon and Irene Castle played one of their last vaudeville engagements at the Palace. And interestingly, they also had an engagement at the same time at the Victoria across the street. So I don't know if they like sort of did their act and like danced across the traffic and played the Victoria and then danced back. But they're good names to know because they revolutionized dance in this country. It's kind of oversimplified. Before they came along, it's kind of an Edith Wharton type culture, uptight and waspish. And they brought in racy new dances like the foxtrot and the turkey trot and a lot of other trots named after animals, I guess. And that doesn't seem that daring now, but it was daring back then. Right after, not long after the engagement here, Vernon Castle enlisted in the RAF because he was Canadian, and a few years later he died in a plane crash. So that cut short their meteoric career. Also, when this war started, Nora Bayes, who was known to audiences by the unfortunate handle The Würzburger Girl, found herself trapped at some sort of health spa in Germany when the war broke out. And rumors circulated that she'd been captured by the Germans or killed or both. And by this point, she was already a well-known star. She'd co-written and performed Shine On Harvest Moon with her husband Jack Norworth at the time. And so there was a lot of talk about, she got killed or captured or something, and then she hadn't. So when she came back and she opened at the Palace, it was a big deal, And even though there wasn't that grand adventure, you know how the press sort of attaches it? There's no way to get rid of something like that. So why not exploit it? She seemed like the lady who had escaped from the Germans. That's basically it. And so she was a big hit here. She became the greatest. This was her tagline: the greatest single woman singing comedian in the world. There's no room for any doubt there. The greatest single woman singing comedian in the world. And then when the Americans joined the war in 1917, and George M. Cohan held a meeting in the Palace Auditorium, where we'll be in just a few minutes, he asked all the assembled entertainers who wanted to volunteer to entertain the troops, and everybody stood up. Bayes herself, to get back to Nora Bayes, she went on such tours, and it was she that George M. Cohan chose to introduce his song Over There. But patriotism notwithstanding, however, Bayes was known as one of the most temperamental divas in vaudeville. Some theorize that the cancer that eventually killed her was already advancing during those 1914 treatments, and that was an explanation for her volatile temperament. But there are a couple of examples of things that happened at the Palace that touch on that. She, at a benefit performance here in 1927, she got into a fight with Sophie Tucker. And apparently it was a real knockdown, drag-out, vicious fight about something really important like the billing or whose name is on top of whose, or who gets the best dressing room or something. And so the booker here, a guy named Eddie Darling, physically pushed her into the street and locked the door and said, "You're not playing here again." Just at one time had been one of the biggest stars. A year later, after having been banned from the Palace, a very strange Sunset Boulevard-like scenario took place. Apparently, she called Eddie Darling and invited him to her house for a party, and when he arrived, there was nobody else there. And then she sort of sat and played some of her songs for him, and then she asked if he would, for old time's sake, hang her publicity photos in the lobby. And though there was no engagement, she just asked him to kind of do that. And so she could go and have a last look. And so he did that for her, and she came and she saw the photos, and a couple of days later she was dead. Moving right along. Sad story. You need a little pathos in there. In 1915, Willie Hammerstein was the brilliant booker, the son of Oscar Hammerstein, across the street, died. And the Victoria didn't long outlast him. They sold it off, became a movie house. So that means that the Palace was now going to be the only game in town, really, in Times Square. The monopoly, the undisputed mecca of all vaudevillians. The sidewalk out in front here is where they would go and schmooze. It sounds very impractical now when you can't even walk down the street. But people like, you would see George Jessel and Eddie Cantor and people like that out there shaking hands and exchanging business cards and talking about possibilities for employment and the whole 9 yards throughout the life of the Palace as a vaudeville house. In 1919, there debuted a man destined to leave a greater mark here and on show business than any other, in my opinion. If you take only one factoid away from this talk, besides the Palace itself, I hope it'll be the name of Frank Fay. Like the Palace and vaudeville itself, Fay was an important American institution who's been unjustly just forgotten. It might be arguable, but I consider him the father of all modern American stand-up comedy. And the art of emceeing, I guess it's strange to consider that an art, but it is, and a separate one, I think, from doing stand-up. He's kind of the founder, the Lucy of that. There'd been monologists before. There'd been music called chairman, which is its own specialization. There'd been tentative experiments with emceeing, but Fay came here to the Palace, and he was such a hit that they let him host the show. And that went so well that they booked him separately, always for several weeks, and he established the efficacy of the role of MC. So well, it became a part of the permanent format of variety. In the old days, they had those printed cards, you know, like Petunia and her poodles or whatever. And, you know, then the violin would play, and then the stage manager would come change the card. But after Frank Fay, it's a comedian who comes out and warms up the show and fools around with the acts and that kind of stuff. Fay's influence as a comedian and an MC can be traced down the line to everyone from Bob Hope and Jack Benny, to Ed Sullivan and Milton Berle, to John. I know Ed Sullivan's not too funny, but the idea that a guy's going to come out and be warm and talk to, well, he couldn't be warm yet, but the idea that it'd be somebody there. And Milton Berle, and you can trace that all the way to like Johnny Carson and to Letterman and Leno. By the mid-20s, many others were striving to hit the high mark Fay had hit as MC at the Palace. Jack Benny hosted here in 1927. Others included Eddie Cantor, Georgie Jessel, Jack Haley, Benny Rubin. The first female host was Gracie Allen. She and George Byrne debuted here in the mid-20s and were one of the hugest hits ever. In 1932, Benny Rubin, a comedian, tap dancer, and trombone player from Boston, was to host, and he came down with appendicitis. And to replace him, they got a former child star who was now struggling to make a name for himself, and it was Milton Berle. And he was a major smash. He had an extended engagement here, and it can be said to be the making of his career and the reason why he got that TV show 16 or 17 years later.
When was this that he had that engagement here?
32,
Oh.
yeah. And then he was in radio for a while, and he didn't become a huge star until TV, and that kind of revived the whole vaudeville idea. How are we doing for time? Okay. Also debuting as comedian and host here in 1932 was a former hoofer, what they called a dancer, now a comedian named Bob Hope. And like a lot of performers, he was terrified and intimidated by the idea of playing the Palace. And he was kind of bombing and nervous when he first got up. Two more veteran comedians kind of helped him out. They joined him on stage and kidded around with him and loosened him up a bit. One of them was another unjustly forgotten person whose name you should know because you know his fellow performers. His name was Ted Healy. Healy was one of the top comics of the day, but the main reason he should be better known is because he employed a trio of helpers, or let's call them stooges. Larry, Moe, and Shemp. Curly didn't join the team until they went into movies, really. But in those days, it was very common. It was the sort of thing that would happen here quite a lot, to have a surprise happen in the form of a ringer that nobody knows is, and you still see this on TV, like they'll do it on Letterman, you know. Suddenly, a man stands up in his seat and it's like causes a commotion. And that's how they started out. There were a lot of stooges in the business. They just happened to be his stooges. And then they branded themselves, and now they're the only stooges, which is weird. And then he was, you know, the team broke up, and they did great in movies, and he did poorly. And now nobody knows who Ted Healy is, even though he was the star, and they were just the stooges.